Section 2. New religious movements. The epoch of the First Crusade was one of increasing religious earnestness, manifesting itself in otherworldliness, asceticism, mystical piety, and emphasis on the monastic life. The long battle against simony and Nicolaitanism had turned popular sympathies from the often criticized, secular, or ordinary clergy, to the monks as the true representatives of the religious ideal. Cluny had, in a measure, spent its force. Its very success had led to luxury of living. New religious associations were arising, of which the most important was that of the Cistercians, an order which dominated the 12th century as Cluny had the 11th. Like Cluny, the Cistercians were of French origin. A Benedictine monk, Robert, of the monastery of Montier, impressed with the ill discipline of contemporary monasticism, founded a monastery of great strictness in Citeaux, not far from Dijon, in 1098. From the first, the purpose of the foundation of Citeaux was to cultivate a strenuous, self-denying life. Its buildings, utensils, even the surroundings of worship, were of the plainest character. In food and clothing it exercised great austerity. Its rule was that of Benedict, but its self-denial was far beyond that of Benedictines generally. Under its third abbot, Stephen Harding, 1109–1134, an Englishman, the significance of Citeaux rapidly grew. For affiliated monasteries were founded by 1115, under his leadership. Henceforth its progress was rapid throughout all the West. By 1130, the Cistercian houses numbered 30, by 1168, 288, and a century later 671. Over all these the abbot of Citeaux had authority, assisted by a yearly assembly of the heads of the affiliated monasteries. Much attention was devoted to agriculture, relatively little to teaching or pastoral work. The ideals were withdrawal from the world, contemplation, and imitation of apostolic poverty. Not a little of the early success of the Cistercians was due to the influence of Bernard, 1090–1153, the greatest religious force of his age, and, by common consent, deemed one of the chief of medieval saints. Born of knightly ancestry in Fontaines, near Dijon, he inherited from his mother a deeply religious nature. With some 30 companions, the fruit of his powers of persuasion, he entered the monastery of Citeaux, probably in 1112. Thence he went forth in 1115 to found the Cistercian monastery of Clairvaux, abbot of which he remained, in spite of splendid offers of ecclesiastical preferment, till his death. A man of the utmost self-consecration, his prime motive was a love to Christ, which in spite of extreme monastic self-mortification, found so evangelical an expression as to win the hearty approval of Luther and Calvin. The mystic contemplation of Christ was his highest spiritual joy. It determined not merely his own type of piety, but very largely that of the age in its nobler expressions. Above all, men admired in Bernard a moral force, a consistency of character, which added weight to all that he said and did. Bernard was far too much a man of action to be confined to the monastery. The first preacher of his age, and one of the greatest of all ages, he moved his fellows profoundly, from whatever social class they might come. He conducted a vast correspondence on the problems of the time. The interests of the Church, of which he was regarded as the most eminent ornament, led to wide journeyings. In particular, the healing of the papal schism which resulted in the double choice by the cardinals in 1130 of Innocent II, 1130–1143, and Anacletus II, 1130–1138, was Bernard's work. His dominating part in organizing the unfortunate Second Crusade has already been considered, ante, page 242. His influence with the papacy seemed but confirmed when a former monk of Clairvaux was chosen as Eugene III, 1145–1153, though many things that Eugene did proved not to Bernard's liking. Convinced that his own 6. Why be Christ's true disciples? In the struggle between Innocent II and Anacletus II he won a large following in Brescia, but was compelled to seek refuge in France, where he became intimate with Abelard, and was joined with him in condemnation, at Bernard's instigation, by the Synod of Sens, 1141. Bernard secured Arnold's expulsion from France. In 1143 the Roman nobles had thrown off the temporal control of the papacy and established what they believed to be a revival of the Senate. To Rome Arnold went. He was not a political leader so much as a preacher of apostolic poverty. In 1145 Eugene II restored Arnold to church fellowship, but by 1147, Arnold and the Romans had driven Eugene out of the city. There Arnold remained influential till the accession of the vigorous Hadrian IV, 1154 to 1159, the only Englishman who has ever occupied the papal throne. Hadrian, in 1155, compelled the Romans to expel Arnold by proclaiming an interdict forbidding religious services in the city, and bargained with the new German sovereign, Frederick Barbarossa, 1152 to 1190, for the destruction of Arnold as the price of imperial coronation. In 1155 Arnold was hanged and his body burned. Though charged with heresy, these accusations are vague and seem to have had little substance. Arnold's real offense was his attack upon the riches and temporal power of the Church. Far more radical had been a preacher in southern France, in the opening years of the 12th century, Peter of Bruys, of whose origin or early life little is known. With a strict asceticism he combined the denial of infant baptism, the rejection of the Lord's Supper in any form, the repudiation of all ceremonies and even of church buildings, and the rejection of the cross, which should be condemned rather than honored as the instrument through which Christ had suffered. Peter also opposed prayers for the dead. Having burned crosses in St. Gilles, he was himself burned by the mob at an uncertain date, probably between 1120 and 1130. Reputed to be Peter's disciple, but hardly so to be regarded, was Henry, called, of Lausanne, once a Benedictine monk, who preached, with large following, from 1101 till his death after 1145, in western and especially southern France. Above all, a preacher of ascetic righteousness, he denied in ancient Donatist spirit the validity of sacraments administered by unworthy priests. His test of worthiness was ascetic life and apostolic poverty. By this standard he condemned the wealthy and power-seeking clergy. Arnold, Peter, and Henry have been proclaimed Protestants before the Reformation. To do so is to misunderstand them. Their conception of salvation was essentially medieval. They carried to a radical extreme a criticism of the worldly aspects of clerical life which was widely shared and had its more conservative manifestation in the life and teachings of Bernard. Section 3. Anti-churchly sects. Cathari and Waldenses. The Inquisition, the Manichaeism of the later Roman Empire, of which Augustine was once an adherent, Andy, pages 107, 176, seems never absolutely to have died out in the West. It was stimulated by the accession of Paulicians and Bogomiles, Andy, page 235, whom the persecuting policy of the Eastern emperors drove from Bulgaria, and by the new intercourse with the East fostered by the Crusades. The result was a new Manichaeism. Its adherents were called Cathari, as the pure, or Albigenses, from Albi, one of their chief seats in southern France. With the ascetic and enthusiastic impulse which caused and accompanied the Crusades, the Cathari rose to great activity. Though to be found in many parts of Europe, their chief regions were southern France, northern Italy, and northern Spain. In southern France, Bernard himself labored in vain for their conversion. With the criticism of existing churchly conditions consequent upon the disastrous failure of the Second Crusade, Andy, page 242, they multiplied with great rapidity. In 1167 they were able to hold a Wid. The other malign. All agreed that this visible world is the work of the evil power, in which souls, taken prisoners from the realm of the good God, are held in bondage. The greatest of sins, the original sin of Adam and Eve, is human reproduction, whereby the number of prison houses is increased. Salvation is by repentance, asceticism, and the consolation. This rite, like baptism in the Church, works forgiveness of sins and restoration to the kingdom of the good God. It is conferred by laying on of hands by one who has received it, together with placing the Gospel of John on the head of the candidate. It is the true apostolical succession. One who has received the consolation becomes perfect, a perfectus, but lest he lose the grace, he must henceforth eschew marriage, avoid oaths, war, possession of property, and the eating of meat, milk, or eggs, since they are the product of the sin of reproduction. The perfect, or, as they were called in France, the Bons Hommes good men, were the real clergy of the Cathari, and there are notices of bishops and even of a pope among them, though exactly what the gradations in authority were it is impossible to say. By a convenient belief the majority of adherents, the credents or believers, were allowed to marry, hold property, and enjoy the good things of this world, even outwardly to conform to the Roman Church, assured that, should they receive the consolation, before death, they would be saved. Those who died unconsoled would, in the opinion of most of the Cat Hari, be reincarnated in human, or even animal, bodies till at last they, too, should be brought to salvation. The believers seem not always to have been fully initiated into the tenets of the system. The Cat Hari made great use of Scripture, which they translated and in which they claimed to find their teachings. Some rejected the Old Testament entirely as the work of the evil power, others accepted the Psalms and the prophets. All believed the New Testament to come from the good God. Since all things material are of evil, Christ could not have had a real body or died a real death. They therefore rejected the cross. The sacraments, with their material elements, were evil. The good God is dishonored by the erection of churches built and ornamented with material creations of the evil power. The services of the Cat Hari were simple. The scriptures were read, especially the Gospel of John, as the most spiritual of all. A sermon was preached. The believers then knelt and adored the Perfect as those indwelt with the Divine Spirit. The Perfect, in turn, gave their blessing. Only the Lord's Prayer was used in the service. A common meal, at which the bread was consecrated, was held in many places once a month, as a kind of Lord's Supper. The student of the movement will find in it extremely interesting survivals of ancient Christian rites and ceremonies, orthodox and heretical. In general, the Perfect seem to have been men and women of uprightness, moral earnestness, and courageous steadfastness in persecution. Of their effectiveness in gaining the allegiance of thousands, especially from the humbler walks of life, there can be no question. Unlike the Cat Hari, the Waldenses originated in no conscious hostility to the Church and, had they been treated with skill, would probably never have separated from it. In 1176 Valdez, or Waldo, a rich merchant of Lyons, impressed by the song of a wandering minstrel recounting the sacrifices of Saint Alexis, asked a master of theology the best way to God. The clergyman quoted that golden text of monasticism, "If thou wouldst be perfect, go, sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me." Valdez put this counsel literally into practice. Providing modestly for his wife and daughters, he gave the rest of his means to the poor. He determined to fulfill the directions of Christ to the apostles. Absolutely. He would wear the R.A. Excommunicated, in 1184, by Pope Lucius III, 1181–1185. These unwise acts of the papacy not only forced the Waldenses out of the Church against their will, they brought to them a considerable accession. The Humiliati were a company of lowly folk who had associated themselves for a common life of penance in and about Milan. These, too, were forbidden to hold separate meetings, or to preach, by Alexander III, and were excommunicated in 1184 for disobedience. A very considerable part of these Lombard Humiliati now joined the Waldenses, and came under the control of Valdez. The early characteristics of the Waldenses now rapidly developed. Chief of all was the principle that the Bible, and especially the New Testament, is the sole rule of belief and life. Yet they read it through thoroughly medieval spectacles. It was to them a book of law-of-minute prescriptions, to be followed to the letter. Large portions were learned by heart. In accordance with what they believed to be its teachings they went about, 2 by 2, preaching, clad in a simple woolen robe, barefooted or wearing sandals, living wholly on the gifts of their hearers, fasting on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, rejecting oaths and all shedding of blood, and using no prayers but the Lord's and a form of grace at table. They heard confessions, observed the Lord's Supper together, and ordained their members as a ministry. As unbiblical, they rejected masses and prayers for the dead, and denied purgatory. They held the sacraments invalid if dispensed by unworthy priests. They believed prayer in secret more effective than in church. They defended lay preaching by men and women. They had bishops, priests, and deacons, and a head, or rector, of the society. The first was Valdez himself, later appointment was by election. Besides this inner circle, the society proper, they soon developed a body of sympathizers, friends, or believers, from whom the society was recruited, but who remained outwardly in communion with the Roman Church. Most of this development seems to have been immediately subsequent to their excommunication in 1184. Much of it was due to Catharite example, yet they opposed the Cathari and justly regarded themselves as widely different. Certain conflicts of opinion, and a feeling that the government of Valdez was arbitrary, led to the secession of the Lombard branch by 1210, a breach that attempts at reunion in 1218, after Valdez's death, failed to heal. The two bodies remained estranged. The able Pope, Innocent III, 1198–1216, improved these disputes by countenancing in 1208 the organization of Pauperes Catholici, which allowed many of the practices of the Waldenses under strict churchly oversight. Considerable numbers were thus won back to the Church. Nevertheless, the Waldensian body spread. Waldenses were to be found in northern Spain, in Austria and Germany, as well as in their original homes. They were gradually repressed, till their chief seat came to be the Alpine valleys southwest of Turin, where they are still to be found. At the Reformation they readily accepted its principles, and became fully Protestant. Under modern religious freedom they are laboring with success in many parts of Italy. Their story is one of heroic endurance of persecution, a most honorable history, and they are the only medieval sect which still survives, though with wide modification of their original ideals and methods. By the opening of the 13th century the situation of the Roman Church in southern France, northern Italy, and northern Spain was dubious. Missionary efforts to convert Cathari and Waldenses had largely failed. It was felt that sharper measures were needed. A crusade was ordered as early as 1181 by Pope Alexander III, 1159–1181, against the Viscount of Béziers as a supporter of the Cathari, but it accomplished little. Under Innocent III, 1198–1216, the storm broke. After having vainly tried missionary efforts, the murder of the papal legate, Peter of C. led to like prohibitions in Spain and elsewhere. No universal denial of Bible reading by the laity was issued during the Middle Ages. A second act of significance which marked the Synod of Toulouse was the beginning of a systematic inquisition. The question of the punishment of heretics had been undetermined in the earlier Middle Ages. There had been a good many instances of death, generally by fire, at the hands of rulers, churchmen, or the mob, but ecclesiastics of high standing had opposed. The identification of the Cathari with the Manichaeans, against whom the later Roman emperors had denounced the death penalty, gave such punishment the sanction of Roman law. Peter II of Aragon, in 1197, ordered the execution of heretics by fire. Pope Innocent III, 1198–1216, held that heresy, as treason against God, was of even greater heinousness than treason against a king. The investigation of heresy was not as yet systematized. That task the Synod of Toulouse undertook. Its work was speedily perfected by Pope Gregory IX, 1227–1241, who entrusted the discovery of heresy to inquisitors chosen chiefly from the Dominican order, a body formed with very different aims. As speedily developed, the Inquisition became a most formidable organ. Its proceedings were secret, the names of his accusers were not given to the prisoner, who, by a bull of Innocent IV, in 1252, was liable to torture. The confiscation of the convict's property was one of its most odious and economically destructive features, and, as these spoils were shared by the lay authorities, this feature undoubtedly kept the fires of persecution burning where otherwise they would have died out. Yet, thanks to the Inquisition, and other more praiseworthy means shortly to be described, the Cathari were utterly rooted out in the course of a little more than a century, and the Waldenses greatly repressed. This earlier success accounts, in large measure, for the tenacity with which the Roman Church clung to the Inquisition in the Reformation age. Section 4. The Dominicans and Franciscans. The Cathari and Waldenses profoundly affected the medieval Church. Out of an attempt to meet them by preachers of equal devotion, asceticism, and zeal, and of greater learning, grew the order of the Dominicans. In the same atmosphere of apostolic poverty, and literal fulfillment of the commands of Christ in which the Waldenses flourished, the Franciscans had their birth. In these two orders medieval monasticism had its noblest exemplification. In Francis of Assisi medieval piety had its highest and most inspiring representative. Dominic was a native of Caleroga, in Castile, and was born in 1170. A brilliant student in Palencia, and a youth of deep religious spirit, he became a canon of Osma, about 90 miles northeast of Madrid. From 1201 he enjoyed the friendship of a kindred spirit, Diego of Acevedo, the Bishop of Osma. The two journeyed on political business in 1203 through southern France, where the Cathari were then in the height of their power. There they found the Roman missionaries treated with contempt. At a meeting with these missionary leaders in Montpellier, in 1204, Diego urged a thorough reform of method. Only by missionaries as self-denying, as studious of apostolic poverty, and as eager to preach as the perfect of the Cathari, could these wanderers be won back to the Roman fold. Moved by the bishop's exhortation, the missionaries endeavored to put his advice into practice. A nunnery, chiefly for converted Catharite women, was established in 1206, in Pruille, not far from Toulouse. Thus far Diego seems to have been the leader, but he had to return to his diocese, and died in 1207. Thenceforward Dominic carried on the work. The storm of the great anti-Cathari war made it most discouraging. Dominic was tempted by the offer of bishoprics to leave so thankless a task, but he persisted. He would take the Apostle Paul as his model. He would win the people by preaching. Gradually he gathered. Chapter, or that of the following year, the constitution of the Order of Preachers, or Dominicans, as they were popularly called, was developed. At the head was a Master General, chosen by the General Chapter, originally for life. The field was divided into provinces, each in charge of a provincial prior, elected for a 4-year term by the provincial chapter. Each monastery chose a prior, also for 4 years. The general chapter included the Master General, the provincial priors, and an elected delegate from each province. The system was one, therefore, that combined ingeniously authority and representative government. It embraced monasteries for men, and nunneries for women, though the latter were not to preach, but ultimately developed large teaching activities. Dominic died in 1221. The order then numbered 60 houses, divided among the 8 provinces of Provence, Toulouse, France, Lombardy, Rome, Spain, Germany, and England, and for years thereafter it increased rapidly. Always zealous for learning, it emphasized preaching and teaching, sought work especially in university towns, and soon became widely represented on the university faculties. Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, the theologians, Eckhart and Tauler, the mystics, Savonarola, the reformer, are but a few of the great names that adorn the catalogue of Dominicans. Their learning led to their employment as inquisitors, a use that formed no part of Dominic's ideal. The legends which represent him as an inquisitor are baseless. He would win men, as did his example, Paul, by preaching. To achieve that result he would undergo whatever sacrifice or asceticism that would make his preachers acceptable to those whom they sought. Yet it is evident that lowly, self-sacrificing and democratic as were Dominic's aims, the high intellectualism of his order tended to give it a relatively aristocratic flavor. It represented, however, an emphasis on work for others, such as had appeared in the Waldenses. Its ideal was not contemplation apart from the world, but access to men in their needs. Great as was the honor paid to Dominic and the Dominicans, it was exceeded by the popular homage given to the Franciscans, and especially to their founder. The austere preacher, of blameless youth, planning how he may best reach men, and adopting poverty as a means to that end, is not so winsome a figure as that of the gay, careless young man who sacrifices all for Christ and his fellows, and adopts poverty not as a recommendation of his message, but as the only means of being like his master. In Francis of Assisi is to be seen not merely the greatest of medieval saints, but one, who through his absolute sincerity of desire to imitate Christ in all things humanly possible, belongs to all ages and to the Church universal. Giovanni Bernardone was born in 1181 or 1182, the son of a cloth merchant of Assisi, in central Italy. To the boy the nickname Francesco Francis was given, and soon supplanted that bestowed on him in baptism. His father, a serious man of business, was little pleased to see the son leading in the mischief and revelry of his young companions. A year's experiences as a prisoner of war in Perugia, following a defeat in which he had fought on the side of the common people of Assisi, against the nobles, wrought no change in his life. A serious illness began to develop another side of his character. He joined a military expedition to Apulia, but withdrew, for what reason is not evident. His conversion was a gradual process. When I was yet in my sins it did seem to me too bitter to look upon the lepers, but the Lord himself did lead me among them, and I had compassion upon them. When I left them, that which had seemed to me bitter had become sweet and easy. This note of Christ-like compassion was that to which Francis's renewed nature first responded. On a pilgrimage to Rome he thought he heard the divine command to restore the fallen house of God. Taking it leader. And humbled deference to the priests as his representatives. The Most High himself revealed to me that I ought to live according to the model of the Holy Gospel. Like-minded associates gathered about him. For them he drafted a rule, composed of little besides selections from Christ's commands, and with it, accompanied by 11 or 12 companions, he applied to Pope Innocent III for approval. It was practically the same request that Valdez had preferred in vain in 1179. But Innocent was now trying to win some of the Waldenses for the Church, and Francis was not refused. The associates now called themselves the Penitents of Assisi, a name for which, by 1216, Francis had substituted that of the minor, or humbler, brethren, by which they were henceforth to be known. Francis's association was a union of imitators of Christ, bound together by love and practicing the utmost poverty, since only thus, he believed, could the world be denied and Christ really followed. 2 by 2, they went about preaching repentance, singing much, aiding the peasants in their work, caring for the lepers and outcasts. Let those who know no trade learn one, but not for the purpose of receiving the price of their toil, but for their good example and to flee idleness. And when we are not given the price of our work, let us resort to the table of the Lord, begging our bread from door to door. Soon wide-reaching missionary plans were formed, which the rapid growth of the association made possible of attempting. Francis himself, prevented by illness from reaching the Mohammedans through Spain, went to Egypt in 1219, in the wake of a crusading expedition, and actually preached before the Sultan. Francis himself was little of an organizer. The free association was increasing enormously. What were adequate rules for a handful of like-minded brethren were soon insufficient for a body numbering several thousands. Change would have come in any event. It was hastened, however, by the organizing talents of Cardinal Ugolino of Ostia, the later Pope Gregory IX, 1227–1241, who had befriended Francis, and whose appointment Francis secured as protector of the society. Under Ugolino's influence, and that of Brother Elias of Cortona, the transformation of the association into a full monastic order went rapidly forward. From the time of Francis's absence in Egypt and Syria in 1219 and 1220, his real leadership ceased. A new rule was adopted in 1221, and a third in 1223. In the latter, emphasis was no longer laid on preaching, and begging was established as the normal, not the exceptional, practice. Already, in 1219, provinces had been established, each in charge of a minister. Papal directions, in 1220, had prescribed obedience to the order's officers, established a novitiate, a fixed costume, and irrevocable vows. Probably most of these changes were inevitable. They were unquestionably a grief to Francis, though whether so deeply as has often been contended is doubtful. He was always deferential to ecclesiastical authority, and seems to have regarded these modifications more with regret than with actual opposition. He withdrew increasingly from the world. He was much in prayer and singing. His love of nature, in which he was far in advance of his age, was never more manifest. Feeble in body, he longed to be present with Christ. He bore what men believed to be the reproduction of Christ's wounds. How they may have been received is an unsolved, and perhaps insoluble, problem. On October 3, 1226, he died in the church of Portiuncula. 2 years later he was proclaimed a saint by Pope Gregory IX. Few men in Christian history have more richly deserved the title. In organization, by Francis's death, the Franciscans were like the Dominicans. At the head stood a minister general, chosen for 12 years. Over each province was a provincial minister, and over each group a custos, for, unlike the Dominicans, the Franciscans did not at first possess houses. As wit. Why undermine the influence of the bishops and ordinary clergy, since they were privileged to preach and absolve anywhere? They thus strengthened the power of the papacy by diminishing that of the ordinary clergy. One chief influence upon the laity was the development of the tertiaries, or third orders, a phenomenon which first appeared in connection with the Franciscans, though the tradition which connects it with Francis himself is probably baseless. The third order permitted men and women, still engaged in ordinary occupations, to live a semi-monastic life of fasting, prayer, worship, and benevolence. A conspicuous illustration is Saint Elizabeth of Thuringia, 1207–1231. Ultimately all the mendicant orders developed tertiaries. As time went on the system tended to become an almost complete monasticism, from which the married were excluded. It must be regarded as a very successful attempt to meet the religious ideals of an age which regarded the monastic as the true Christian life. The piety of the 12th and 13th centuries found many expressions other than through the Dominicans and Franciscans. One important manifestation, especially in the Netherlands, Germany, and France, was through the Beguines associations of women living in semi-monastic fashion, but not bound by irrevocable vows. They seem to have received their name from those hostile to them in memory of the preacher of Liège, Lambert le Bègue, who was regarded as having been a heretic, and the Beguine movement undoubtedly often sheltered anti-churchly sympathizers. It was in the main orthodox, however, and spread widely, existing in the Netherlands to the present. Its loose organization made effective discipline difficult, and, in general, its course was one of deterioration. A parallel, though less popular, system of men's associations was that of the Beghards. The divisions in the Franciscan order, which had appeared in Francis's lifetime between those who would emphasize a simple life of Christ-like poverty and those who valued numbers, power, and influence, were but intensified with his death. The stricter party found a leader in Brother Leo, the looser in Elias of Cortona. The papal policy favored the looser, since ecclesiastical politics would be advanced by the growth and consolidation of the order along the lines of earlier monasticism. The quarrel became increasingly embittered. The use of gifts and buildings was secured by the laxer party on the claim that they were held not by the order itself but by friends. Pope Innocent IV, 12438–1254, in 1245, allowed such use, with the reservation that it was the property of the Roman Church, not of the order. These tendencies the stricter party vigorously opposed. But that party itself fell into dubious orthodoxy. Joachim of Flores, in extreme southern Italy, 1145–1202, a Cistercian abbot who had been reputed a prophet, had divided the history of the world into 3 ages, those of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That of the Spirit was to come in full power in 1269. It was to be an age of men who understood the eternal gospel, not a new gospel, but the old, spiritually interpreted. Its form of life was to be monastic. In the 6th decade of the 13th century many of the stricter Franciscans adopted these views and were persecuted not merely by the laxer element, but by the moderates, who obtained leadership when Bonaventura was chosen general minister in 1257. These stricter friars of prophetic faith were nicknamed spirituals. Under Pope John XXI, 1316–1334, some of the party were burned by the Inquisition in 1318. During his papacy a further quarrel arose as to whether the poverty of Christ and the Apostles was complete. John XXII decided in 1322 in favor of the laxer view, and imprisoned the great English schoolman, William of Ockham, and other assertors of Christ's absolute poverty. The quarrel was irreconcilable, and finally Pope Leo X, 1513–1521, formally recognized the d. Scholasticism. Most of the knowledge of dialectic method was at first derived from scanty translations of portions of Aristotle's writings and of Porphyry's isagogy, both the work of Boëtius, 480-524. The development of scholasticism was inaugurated and accompanied by a discussion as to the nature of universals, that is, as to the existence of genera and species, a debate occasioned by Porphyry's isagogy. Three positions might be taken. The extreme realists, following Platonic influences, page 3, asserted that universals existed apart from an antecedent to the individual objects rem. 2. The genus man was anterior to and determinative of the individual man. The moderate realists, under the guidance of Aristotle, page 4, taught that universals existed only in connection with individual objects in re. The nominalists, following Stoic precedent, held that universals were only abstract names for the resemblances of individuals, and had no other existence than in thought post-rem. The only real existence for them was the individual object. This quarrel between realism and nominalism continued throughout the scholastic period and profoundly influenced its theological conclusions. The first considerable scholastic controversy was a renewal of the dispute once held between Paschasius Radbertus and Ratramnus as to the nature of Christ's presence in the Lord's Supper, page 211. Berenger, 1088, head of the cathedral school in Tours about 1049, attacked the prevalent conception that the elements are changed as to substance into the actual body and blood of Christ. His position was essentially nominalist. Berenger was immediately opposed by Lanfranc, 1089, then prior of the monastery of Bee in Normandy, and to be William the Conqueror's celebrated Archbishop of Canterbury. Berenger was condemned at the Roman Synod of 1050. He conformed and was restored in 1059. About 10 years later he reasserted his opinions, but once more withdrew them in 1079, only to declare them again. The discussion showed that the view soon to be known as transubstantiation had become the dominant opinion in Latin Christendom. It was to have full approval at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, where it was given the highest dogmatic standing. Berenger's dialectic methods were employed, with very dissimilar results, by Anselm, who has often been called the father of the schoolmen. Born in Aosta in northern Italy about 1033, Anselm became a monk under Lanfranc in Bee, whom he succeeded as prior. Under him the school of Bec attained great distinction. In 1093 he became Archbishop of Canterbury, having a stormy episcopate by reason of his Hildebrandian principles. He died in office in 1109. As a theologian, Anselm was an extreme realist, and was moreover convinced of the full capacity of a proper dialectic to prove the truths of theology. His famous ontological demonstration of the existence of God is at once realistic and Neoplatonic. As set forth in his Proslogion, God is the greatest of all beings. He must exist in reality as well as in thought, for if he existed in thought only, a yet greater being, existing in reality as well as in thought, could be conceived, which is impossible. This proof, which aroused the opposition of Ganilo, a monk of Marmoutiers, in Anselm's lifetime, seems to most a play on words, though its permanent validity has not lacked defenders. Anselm next directed his attention to Roscelin, a canon of Compiègne, who, under nominalistic influence, had asserted that either the Father, Son, and Spirit are identical or are three gods. At a synod held in Soissons in 1092 Roscelin was compelled to abjure tritheism. Anselm now declared that nominalism was essentially heretical, and that view was the prevalent one for the next 2 centuries. Anselm's most influential contribution to theology was his discussion of the atonement in his Cur Deus Homo, the ablest treatment that had yet appeared. Anselm totally. Ines of the Church. I believe, that I may understand, is a motto that expresses his attitude. The same high realist position was maintained by William of Champeaux, 1070-1121, who brought the school of Saint Victor, near Paris, into great repute, and died as Bishop of Chalons. The ablest use of the dialectic method in the 12th century was made by Abelard, 1079-1142, a man of irritating method, vanity, and critical spirit, but by no means of irreligion. Born in Palette, in Brittany, he studied under Roscelin and William of Champeaux, both of whom he opposed and undoubtedly far surpassed in ability. On the vexed question of the universals he took a position intermediate between the nominalism of one teacher and the realism of the other, though leaning rather to the nominalist side. Only individuals exist, but genera and species are more than names. Hence he is usually called a conceptualist, though he gave universals greater value than mere mental conceptions. Abelard's life was stormy. By the age of 22 he was teaching with great following in Melun, near Paris. By 1115 he was a canon of Notre Dame, with a following in Paris such as no lecturer had yet enjoyed. He fell in love with Heloise, the niece of his fellow canon, Fulbert, a woman of singular devotion of nature. With her he entered into a secret marriage. The enraged uncle, believing his niece deceived, revenged himself by having Abelard emasculated, and thus barred from clerical advancement. Abelard now became a monk. To teach was his breath of life, however, and he soon resumed lecturing. A reply to Roscelin's tritheism leaned so far in the other direction that his enemies charged him with Sabellianism, and his views were condemned at a synod in Soissons in 1121. His criticisms of the traditional career of Saint Denis made the monastery of Saint Denis an uncomfortable place of abode, and he now sought a hermit's life. Students gathered about him and founded a little settlement which he called the Paraclete. His criticisms had aroused, however, the hostility of that most powerful religious leader of the age, the orthodox traditionalist Bernard, and he now sought refuge as abbot of the rough monastery in Ruis, in remote Brittany. Yet he left this retreat to lecture for a while in Paris, and engaged in a correspondence with Heloise, who had become the head of a little nunnery at the Paraclete, which is the most interesting record of affection especially on the part of Heloise, which the Middle Ages has preserved. Bernard procured his condemnation at the Synod of Sens in 1141, and the rejection of his appeal by Pope Innocent II. Abelard was now a broken man. He made submission and found a friend in Peter, the abbot of Cluny. In 1142 he died in one of the monasteries under Cluny jurisdiction. Abelard's spirit was essentially critical. Without rejecting the Fathers or the creeds, he held that all should be subjected to philosophical examination, and not lightly believed. His work, Sic et non yes and no setting against each other contrary passages from the Fathers on the great doctrines, without attempt at harmony or explanation, might well arouse a feeling that he was a sower of doubts. His doctrine of the Trinity was almost Sabellian. His teaching that man has inherited not guilt but punishment from Adam was contrary to the Augustinian tradition. His ethical theory that good and evil inhere in the intention rather than in the act, disagreed with current feeling. His belief that the philosophers of antiquity were sharers of divine revelation, however consonant with ancient Christian opinion, was not that of his age. Nor was Abelard less individual, though decidedly modern, in his conception of the atonement. Like Anselm, he rejected all ransom to the devil, but he repudiated Anselm's doctrine of satisfaction no less energetically. In Abelard's view the incarnation and death of Christ are the highest expression of God's love to men, the effect of which is to awaken. Istic fashion he pictured spiritual progress as in 3 stages: cogitation, the formation of sense concepts; meditation, their intellectual investigation; contemplation, the intuitive penetration into their inner meaning. This last attainment is the true mystical vision of God, and the comprehension of all things in him. No original genius, like Abelard and Hugo, but a man of great intellectual service to his own age, and held in honor till the Reformation, was Peter Lombard, the master of the sentences, 1160. Born in humble circumstances in northern Italy, Peter studied in Bologna and Paris, in part at least aided by the generosity of Bernard. In Paris he became ultimately teacher of theology in the school of Notre Dame, and near the close of his life, in 1159, bishop of the Parisian see. Whether he was ever a pupil of Abelard is uncertain, but he was evidently greatly influenced by Abelard's works. Under Hugo of St. Victor he certainly studied, and owed that teacher much. Between 1147 and 1150 he wrote the work on which his fame rests, the 4 books of sentences. After the well-accustomed fashion, he gathered citations from the creeds and the Fathers on the several Christian doctrines. What was fresh was that he proceeded to explain and interpret them by the dialectic method, with great moderation and good sense, and with constant reference to the opinions of his contemporaries. He showed the influence of Abelard constantly, though critical of that thinker's extremer positions. He was even more indebted to Hugo of St. Victor. Under the four divisions, God, created beings, salvation, sacraments and the last things, he discussed the whole round of theology. The result was a handbook which so fully met the needs of the age that it remained till the Reformation the main basis of theological instruction. With the middle of the 12th century the first period of scholasticism was over. The schools continued in increasing activity, but no creative geniuses appeared. The last half of the century was distinguished, however, by the introduction to the West, which had thus far had little of Aristotle, of the greater part of his works and of much Greek philosophy besides, by the Jews of Spain and southern France, who, in turn, derived them from the Arabs. The Latin conquest of Constantinople, in 1204, ante, page 243, led ultimately to direct translations from the originals. The result was to be a new and greater outburst of scholastic activity in the 13th century. Section 6. The universities, cathedral and monastic schools were never more flourishing than in the 12th century. Teachers were multiplying and gathering about them students. Anselm, Abelard, William of Champeaux, Hugo of St. Victor, and Peter Lombard were simply the most eminent of a host. Students flocked to them in large numbers from all parts of Europe. Paris and Oxford were famed for theology, Bologna for church and civil law, Salerno for medicine. Under these circumstances the universities developed in a manner which it is difficult exactly to date. The change which they implied was not the establishment of teaching where none had been before, but the association of students and teachers into a collective body, after the fashion of a trade guild, primarily for protection and good order, but also for more efficient management and the regulation of admission to the teaching profession. In its educational capacity such a group was often called a studium generale. The beginnings of university organization which must be distinguished from the commencement of teaching may be placed about the year 1200. By the close of the 12th century there were in Bologna 2 universities, or mutual protective associations of students. The organization in Paris became normal, however, for Northern Europe. Its earliest rules date from about 1208, and its recognition as a legal corporation from a letter of Pope Innocent III of about 1211. In Paris there was a single universitaire. Bachelor was similar to an admission to apprenticeship in a guild. The second degree, that of master or doctor, resembling the master workman in a guild, carried with it full authority to teach in the institution where it was conferred, and soon, for the graduates of the larger universities, to teach anywhere. The use of Latin as the sole language of the classroom made possible the assembly of students from all parts of Europe, and they flocked to the more famous universities in immense numbers. The needs of these students, many of whom were of extreme poverty, early aroused the interest of benefactors. One of the most influential and oldest foundations thus established was that formed in Paris by Robert de Sorbonne, 1201–1274, in 1252. It provided a home and special teaching for poor students, under the guidance of fellows of the house. Such establishments, soon known as colleges, rapidly multiplied, and gave shelter to the great majority of students, rich and poor. The system still survives in the English universities. So prominently was the Sorbonne identified with theological instruction that its name came to be popularly, though erroneously, attached to the faculty of theology in Paris. That university ranked till the Reformation as the leader of Europe, especially in the theological studies. Universities, many of which were short-lived, sprang up with great rapidity. In general, they were regarded as ecclesiastical authorization by the Pope being almost essential. The most conspicuous early lay approval was that of Naples, in 1225, by the Emperor Frederick II. Section 7. High Scholasticism and its theology. The recovery of the whole of Aristotle, the rise of the universities, and the devotion of the mendicant orders to learning, ushered in a new period of scholasticism in the 13th century, and marked the highest intellectual achievement of the Middle Ages. The movement toward this modern theology, as it was called, was not without much opposition, especially from traditionalists and adherents to the Augustinian Neoplatonic development. Aristotle met much hostility. A series of great thinkers, all from the mendicant orders, made his victory secure. Yet even they, while relying primarily on Aristotle, made much use of Plato as reflected in Augustine and the Pseudo-Dionysius, Andy, pages 171, 266. To Alexander of Hales, 1245, an Englishman and ultimately a Franciscan, who taught in Paris, was due the treatment of theology in the light of the whole of Aristotle. Yet to him the scripture is the only final truth. With this new period of scholasticism a broader range of intellectual interest is apparent than in the earlier, though the old problem between realism and nominalism continued its preeminence. Alexander was a moderate realist. Universals exist ante-rem in the mind of God, in re in the things themselves, and post-rem in our understanding. In this he was followed by Albertus Magnus and Aquinas. Albertus Magnus, 1206-1280, a German and a Dominican, studied in Padua, and taught in many places in Germany, but principally in Cologne. He served as provincial prior for his order, and was, for a few years, Bishop of Regensburg. The most learned man of his age, his knowledge of science was really remarkable. His acquaintance not merely with Aristotle, but with the comments of Arabian scholars, was profounder than that of Alexander of Hales. He was, however, a great compiler and commentator rather than an original theological genius. That which he taught was brought to far clearer expression by his pupil, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, 1225-1274, was a son of Landulf, Count of Aquino, a small town about halfway between Rome and Naples. Connected with the German imperial house of Hohenstaufen and with that of Tancred, the Norman Crusader, it was against the wishes of his parents that Thomas entered the Dominican order in 1243. His spiritual superiors were aware of his promise, and sent him to Cologne to St. Rayerful man. Intellectually his work was marked by a clarity, a logical consistency, and a breadth of presentation that places him among the few great teachers of the Church. In the Roman Communion his influence has never ceased. By declaration of Pope Leo XIII, 1878-1903, in 1879, his work is the basis of present theological instruction. Closely associated with Aquinas in friendship and for a time in teaching activities in the University of Paris, was John Fidanza, 1221-1274, generally known as Bonaventura. Born in Bagnoria, in the States of the Church, he entered the Franciscan order in 1238, rising to become its general in 1257. A year before his death he was made a cardinal. Famed as a teacher in Paris, he was even more distinguished for his administration of the Franciscan order and for his high character. Much less an Aristotelian than Aquinas, he was especially influenced by the Neoplatonic teachings of Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius. He was essentially a mystic. By meditation and prayer one may rise into that union with God which brings the highest knowledge of divine truth. Yet, though a mystic, Bonaventura was a theologian of dialectic ability whose work, more conservative and less original than that of Aquinas, nevertheless commanded high respect. According to Aquinas, in whom scholasticism attained its noblest development, the aim of all theological investigation is to give knowledge of God and of man's origin and destiny. Such knowledge comes in part by reason-natural theology, but the attainments of reason are inadequate. They must be augmented by revelation. That revelation is contained in the Scriptures, which are the only final authority, but they are to be understood in the light of the interpretations of the councils and the fathers in a word, as comprehended by the Church. The truths of revelation cannot be attained by reason, but they are not contrary to reason, and reason can show the inadequacy of objections to them. Aquinas is thus far from sharing Anselm's conviction that all truths of Christianity are philosophically demonstrable, but he holds that there can be no contradiction between philosophy and theology, since both are from God. In treating of God Aquinas combined Aristotelian and Neoplatonic conceptions. He is the first cause. He is pure activity. He is also the most real and perfect of existences. He is the absolute substance, the source and end of all things. As perfect goodness, God does always that which he sees to be right. Regarding the Trinity and the person of Christ, Aquinas stood essentially on the basis of Augustine and the Chalcedonian formula, Andy, page 151. God needs nothing, and therefore the creation of the world was an expression of the divine love which he bestows on the existences he thus called into being. God's providence extends to all events, and is manifested in the predestination of some to everlasting life, and in leaving others to the consequences of sin in eternal condemnation. Aquinas's position is largely determinist. Man has, indeed, in a certain sense, freedom. His will acts, but that does not preclude the determining or permissive providence of God. The divine permission of evil results in the higher good of the whole. Though sin is no less sinful, its existence permits the development of many virtues which go to make strength of character in those who resist. Aquinas abandoned the ancient distinction between soul and spirit. The soul of man is a unit, possessing intellect and will. It is immaterial. Man's highest good is the vision and enjoyment of God. As originally created, man had, in addition to his natural powers, a superadded gift which enabled him to seek that highest good and practice the three Christian virtues: faith, hope, and love. This Adam lost by sin, which also corrupted his natural powers, so that his state became not merely a lack of original righteousness, but a positive turning toward lower aims. Sin is, therefore, more than merely an tie-in for man's sin, and Christ won a merit which deserves a reward. It also moves men to love. Aquinas thus developed and combined views presented by Anselm and Abelard. Christ's satisfaction superabounds man's sin, and the reward which Christ cannot personally receive, since as God he needs nothing, comes to the advantage of his human brethren. Christ does for men what they cannot do for themselves. Once redeemed, however, the good works that God's grace now enables man to do deserve and receive a reward. Man now has power to fulfill not only the precepts but the counsels of the gospel, page 103. He can do works of supererogation, of which the chief would be the faithful fulfillment of the monastic life. He can not merely fit himself for heaven, he can add his mite to the treasury of the superabundant merits of Christ and the saints. Yet all this is made possible only by the grace of God. Aquinas thus finds full room for the two dominating conceptions of medieval piety: grace and merit. Grace does not come to men indiscriminately. It has its definite channels, and these are the sacraments, and the sacraments alone. Here scholasticism attained far greater clearness of definition than had previously existed. The ancient feeling that all sacred actions were sacraments was still alive in the 12th century, but Hugo of St. Victor and Abelard clearly placed 5 in a more conspicuously sacramental category than others, and Peter Lombard defined the sacraments as 7. Whether this reckoning was original with him is still an unsolved problem, nor was it at once universally accepted. The influence of his sentences ultimately won the day. As enumerated by Peter Lombard, the sacraments are baptism, confirmation, the Lord's Supper, penance, extreme unction, ordination, and matrimony. All were instituted by Christ, directly or through the apostles, and all convey grace from Christ the head to the members of his mystical body, the Church. Without them there is no true union with Christ. Every sacrament consists of 2 elements which are defined in Aristotelian terms of form and matter, page 4, a material portion, water, bread, and wine, etc., and a formula conveying its sacred use, I baptize thee, etc. The administrant must have the intention of doing what Christ and the Church appointed, and the recipient must have, at least in the case of those of years of discretion, a sincere desire to receive the benefit of the sacrament. These conditions fulfilled, the sacrament conveys grace by the fact of its reception, that is, ex opere operato. Of this grace God is the principal cause, the sacrament itself is the instrumental cause. It is the means by which the virtue of Christ's passion is conveyed to his members. By baptism the recipient is regenerated, and original and previous personal sins are pardoned, though the tendency to sin is not obliterated. Man is now given the grace, if he will use it, to resist sin, and the lost power to attain the Christian virtues. Infant baptism had become the universal practice, but in the time of Aquinas immersion was still the more prevalent form, and had his approval. The sole recognized theory regarding Christ's presence in the supper was that which had been taught by Paschasius Radbertus, page 211, and Lanfranc, page 262, and had been known since the first half of the 12th century as transubstantiation. It had been given full dogmatic authority by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Aquinas but added clearness of definition. At the words of consecration by the priest, the miracle is wrought by the power of God, so that while the accidents, shape, taste, and the like, remain unaltered, the substance is transformed into the very body and blood of Christ. Aquinas also accepted and developed the view that the whole body and blood of Christ is present in either element. It was far from original with him, but had grown with the increasing custom of the laity to partake of the bread St. point in the Lord's Supper. It is the continuation of the Incarnation, the repetition of the Passion, the source of spiritual upbuilding to the recipient, the evidence of his union with Christ, and a sacrifice well-pleasing to God, inclining him to be gracious to those in need on earth and in purgatory. Penance, though not reckoned a sacrament of equal dignity with baptism or the Lord's Supper, was really of great, if not prime, importance in medieval practice. Medieval thought regarding the personal religious life centered about the two conceptions of grace and merit. Baptism effected the forgiveness of previous sins, but for those after baptism penance was necessary. The Latin mind has always been inclined to view sin and righteousness in terms of definite acts rather than as states, and therefore to look upon man's relations to God under the aspects of debt and credit, though holding that the only basis of credit is the effect of God's grace. These tendencies were never more marked than in the scholastic period. They represented widespread popular views which the schoolmen explained theologically, rather than originated. According to Aquinas, penance involves four elements: contrition, confession, satisfaction, and absolution. Contrition is sincere sorrow for the offense against God and a determination not to repeat it. Yet Aquinas holds that, as all sacraments convey grace, a penance begun in attrition, that is, in fear of punishment, may by infused grace become a real contrition. Private confession to the priest had made gradual progress since its advocacy by the old British missionaries, Ante, page 197. Abelard and Peter Lombard were of opinion that a true contrition was followed by divine forgiveness, even without priestly confession, though they thought such confession desirable. The Fourth Lateran Council, in 1215, required confession to the priest at least once a year of all laymen of age of discretion. Such confession thereby became church law. Alexander of Hales argued its necessity, and Aquinas gave it more logical exposition. It must be made to the priest as the physician of the soul, and include all deadly sins, the catalogue of which was now much larger than in the early church, Ante, page 100. Though God forgives the eternal punishment of the penitent, certain temporal penalties remain as a consequence of sin. This distinction was clearly made by Abelard and became the current property of the schoolmen. These temporal penalties satisfy the sinner's offense against God so far as it is in his power to do so. They also enable him to avoid sin in the future. They are the fruits of repentance. It is the business of the priest to impose these satisfactions, which, if not adequate in this life, will be completed in purgatory. On evidence thus of sorrow for sin, confession, and a willingness to give satisfaction, the priest, as God's minister or agent, pronounces absolution. Here, then, was the great control of the priesthood over the laity till the Reformation, and in the Roman Church to the present. Without priestly pardon no one guilty after baptism of a deadly sin has assurance of salvation. A great modification of these satisfactions was, however, rapidly growing in the century and a half before Aquinas. A remission of a portion or of all of these temporal penalties could be obtained. Such remission was called an indulgence. Bishops had long exercised the right to abridge satisfactions in cases where circumstances indicated unusual contrition. Great services to the Church were held to deserve such consideration. Peter Damiani, 1007-1072, regarded gifts of land for a monastery or a church as affording such occasions. These did not constitute the full indulgence system, however. That seems to have originated in southern France, and the earliest, though not undisputed, instance is about the year 1016. Their first conspicuous employment was by a French pope, Urban II, 1088-1099, who promised full indulgence. Ndant merits of Christ and of the saints form a treasury of good works from which a portion may be transferred by the authority of the Church, acting through its officers, to the needy sinner. It can, indeed, avail only for those who are really contrite, but for such it removes, in whole or in part, the temporal penalties here and in purgatory. Indulgences were never a license to commit sin. They were an amelioration of penalties justly due to sins already committed and regretted. But, however interpreted, there can be no doubt as to the moral harmfulness of the system, or that it grew worse till the Reformation, of which it was an immediately inducing cause. At their deaths, according to Aquinas, the wicked pass immediately to hell, which is endless, and from which there is no release. Those who have made full use of the grace offered in the Church go at once to heaven. The mass of Christians who have but imperfectly availed themselves of the means of grace must undergo a longer or shorter purification in purgatory. The Church is one, whether in heaven, on earth, or in purgatory. When one member suffers, all suffer; when one does well, all share in his good work. On this unity of the Church Aquinas bases prayers to the saints and for those in purgatory. The visible Church requires a visible head. To be subject to the Roman Pontiff is necessary for salvation. To the Pope, also, belongs the right to issue new definitions of faith, and Aquinas implies the doctrine of papal infallibility. It was Aquinas's good fortune that his philosophy and his theology alike found a hearty disciple in the greatest of medieval poets, Dante Alighieri, 1265–1321, whose Divina Commedia moves, in these respects, almost wholly in Aquinas's realm of thought. Aquinas was a Dominican, and their natural rivalry soon drew upon his system the criticism of Franciscan scholars, many of whom were of English birth. Such a critic was Richard of Middletown, 1300, but the most famous of all, and one of the greatest of the schoolmen, was John Duns Scotus, 12657–1308. In spite of his name he appears to have been an Englishman. Educated in Oxford, where he became its most famous teacher, he removed to Paris in 1304. 4 years later the general of the order sent him to Cologne, where he died just as his work there had begun. The keenest critic and the ablest dialectician of all the schoolmen, he attacked the work of Aquinas with the utmost acumen. He attained a position as authoritative teacher in the Franciscan order similar to that of Aquinas in the Dominican, and the theological rivalries of the Thomists and Scotists continued to rage till the Reformation. Aquinas had held that the essence of God is being. To Scotus, it is arbitrary will. The will in God and man is free. Aquinas held that God did what he saw to be right. To Scotus what God wills is right by the mere fact of willing. Though, like Aquinas, Scotus was a modified realist, he laid emphasis on the individual rather than on the universal. To him the individual is the more perfect form. Since God is absolute will, the sacrifice of Christ has the value which God puts upon it. Any other act would have been sufficient for salvation had God seen fit so to regard it. Nor can we say, with Aquinas, that Christ's death was the wisest way of salvation. That would be to limit God's will. All we can affirm is that it was the way chosen by God. Similarly, Scotus minimized the repentance necessary for salvation. Aquinas has demanded contrition or an attrition, fear of punishment that by the infusion of grace became contrition. Scotus held that attrition is sufficient by divine appointment to secure fitness for pardon. It is followed by forgiveness, and that by the infusion of grace by which a man is enabled to do certain acts to which God has been pleased to attach merit. The sacraments do not of themselves convey grace, but are the conditions appointed by God upon which, if fulfilled, grace is bestowed. T. English Franciscan of the most earnest type, he studied in Oxford, taught in Paris, defended the complete poverty of Christ and the Apostles against Pope John XXX, Ante, page 261, suffered imprisonment, only to escape in 1328 and find refuge with Louis of Bavaria, then in quarrel with the Pope. For the rest of his life he defended the independence of the state from ecclesiastical authority with the utmost steadfastness. Occam attacked any form of realism fiercely. Only individual objects exist. Any association in genera or species is purely mental, having no objective reality. It is simply a use of symbolic terms. Hence, Occam was called a terminist. His system was a far more vigorous and destructive nominalism than that of Roscelin, Ante, page 263. Yet actual knowledge of things in themselves men do not have, only of mental concepts. This denial led him to the conclusion that no theological doctrines are philosophically provable. They are to be accepted, and he accepted them simply on authority. That authority he made in practice that of the Church, though in his contest with what he deemed a derelict papacy he taught that Scripture, and not the decisions of councils and popes, is alone binding on the Christian. No wonder that Luther, in this respect, could call him dear master. Occam's philosophical views gained increasing sway after his death. From thence onward till just before the Reformation, nominalism was the dominant theological position. It was the bankruptcy of scholasticism. While it undoubtedly aided investigation by permitting the freest, philosophical, criticism of existing dogma, it based all Christian belief on arbitrary authority. That was really to undermine theology, for men do not long hold as true what is intellectually indefensible. It robbed of interest the great speculative systems of the older scholasticism. Men turned increasingly, in the 14th and 15th centuries, to mysticism, or returned to Augustine for the intellectual and religious comfort which scholasticism was unable longer to afford. Section 8. The mystics. Besides the intellectual, the mystical tendency was strongly represented in many of the schoolmen. Hugo of St. Victor and Bonaventura may as rightly be reckoned to the mystics as to the scholastics. Aquinas showed marked mystic leanings, derived from Augustine and the Pseudo-Dionysius. Aristotle never wholly conquered Neoplatonic influences. Neoplatonism itself enjoyed a measure of revival in the 12th and 13th centuries, partly through the strongly Neoplatonizing Arabian commentaries on Aristotle, but even more through the widely read Liber de Causis, falsely ascribed to Aristotle, but containing excerpts from the Neoplatonic philosopher, Proclus, 410–485, and ultimately by translations directly from Proclus's accredited works. An important representative of this mystical spirit was Meister Eckhart, 1260–1327, a German Dominican, who studied in Paris, served as provincial prior of the Saxon district, lived for a time in Strasbourg, and taught in Cologne. At the close of his life Eckhart was under trial for heresy. He himself declared his readiness to submit his opinions to the judgment of the Church, but 2 years after his death a number of his teachings were condemned by Pope John XXII. In true Neoplatonic fashion Eckhart taught that that which is real in all things is the divine. In the soul of man is a spark of God. That is the true reality in all men. All individualizing qualities are essentially negative. Man should, therefore, lay them aside. His struggle is to have God born in his soul, that is to enter into full communion with and to come under the control of the indwelling God. In this effort Christ is the pattern and example, in whom Godhead dwelt in humanity in all fullness. With God dominant the soul is filled with love and righteousness. Churchly observances may be of some value, but the springs of the mystic life are far deeper and its end have often led to the claim that he was a Protestant before Protestantism. He emphasized the inward and the vital in religion, and condemned dependence on external ceremonies and dead works. His real position was that of a follower of Eckhart, with similar mystic emphasis on union with the divine, on God being born within, though he avoided the extreme statements which had led to churchly condemnation of Eckhart's opinions. A less practical but widely influential representative of the same tendencies was the ascetic Dominican, Henry Suso, 1866, whose writings did much to further this mystic point of view. Through these influences a whole group of mystic sympathizers was raised up in southwestern Germany and Switzerland, who called themselves Friends of God. These included not only many of the clergy, but nuns and a considerable number of laity. Among the laymen, Roman Merswin, of Strasbourg, 1307–1382, was the most influential. Originally a banker and merchant, he was intimate with Tauler, whose views he shared, and devoted all the latter part of his life to religious labors. He mystified his contemporaries and posterity by letters and books which he set forth purporting to come from a great friend of God, in the Highlands, Switzerland, whose existence was long believed real, but now is practically proved to have been a fiction of Merswin himself. The most important work of these friends of God was the German Theology, written late in the 14th century by an otherwise unknown and unnamed priest of the Deutsche Herrenhaus of Frankfurt, which was to influence Luther, and to be printed by him in 1516 and 1518. These German mystics all leaned strongly toward pantheism. They all, however, represented a view of the Christian life which saw its essence in a transforming personal union of the soul with God, and they all laid little weight on the more external methods of ordinary churchly life. This mystical movement was furthered in the Netherlands by John of Rosbroek, 1294–1381, who was influenced by Eckhart's writings and enjoyed the personal friendship of Tauler and other of the Friends of God. Rosbroek's friend, in turn, was Gerhard Groot, 1340–1384, a brilliant scholar, who upon his conversion, about 1374, became the most influential popular preacher of the Netherlands. A more conservative churchly thinker than Rosbroek, Groot was much less radical in his mysticism. A man of great practical gifts, Groot's work led shortly after his death to the foundation by his disciple, Florentius Radwin, 1350–1400, of the Brethren of the Common Life. This association, of which the first house was established in Deventer, grew out of the union of Groot's converts for a warmer religious life. They grouped themselves in houses of brethren and of sisters, who lived essentially a monastic life under common rules, but without permanent vows, engaged in religious exercises, copying books of edification, and especially in teaching. Work was required of all. These houses were widespread in the Netherlands and in Germany, and did much to promote popular piety in the 15th century. The Brethren of the Common Life were non-monastic in the matter of vows. Groot's preaching led to an influential movement for those who preferred the monastic life, though it, also, did not take full form till shortly after his death. This was the foundation of the famous monastery of Windesheim, which soon gathered a number of affiliated convents about it, and became a reformatory influence of power in the monastic life of the Netherlands and Germany. In both these movements the mystic influence was strongly present, though in a much more churchly form than among the immediate disciples of Eckhart. The noblest product of this simple, mystical, churchly piety is the Imitation of Christ, a book the circulation of which has exceeded that of any other product of the Middle Ages. Though its authorship has been the theme of heated controversy. Eli ever as in Christ, and that the believer cannot sin. He also held that as the Jewish law and ritual had been abolished by the coming of Christ, so that of earlier Christianity was now done away with by the coming of the Holy Spirit. Amalrich was compelled to recant by Pope Innocent III, but he left a number of followers. Similar extravagances kept cropping out in the regions of Germany and the Netherlands, where the mysticism already described had its chief following. In many ways it was simply that mysticism carried to a pantheistic extreme. It was usually quietist, believing that the soul could become one with God by contemplation, and in consequence of that union its acts could no longer be sinful, since it is controlled by God. All sacraments and penances, even prayer, become superfluous. These views were not united into a compact system, nor did their holders constitute a sect, though they have often been so regarded and named the Brethren and Sisters of the Free Spirit. Undoubtedly, however, such notions were rather frequently to be found in monasteries and nunneries, where mysticism was practiced extravagantly, and among the Beguines, whom they brought into doubtful repute. They were not only repressed by the Inquisition, but were opposed by the greater mystic leaders of whom